Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a legal puzzle, really, driven entirely by circumstance and necessity. Imagine an 83-year-old woman, bedridden after a stroke.
Okay.
She gets transported between, say, a rehabilitation center and her home by two different caretakers over about 6 days. When she finally gets back home, her daughter notices she has a broken leg.
Oh, wow.
She knows she was injured due to negligence. I mean, a broken leg doesn't just happen, but she cannot possibly know who did it. Was it the ambulance company during transport or the rehabilitation facility during her stay?
That is the perfect setup for today's deep dive. Because, when the facts, the actual evidence of what happened, are exclusively held by the defendants, the law needs a mechanism. It needs something to shift the evidentiary burden.
Right.
And that mechanism is the legal doctrine res ipsa loquitur, RIL for short. Our mission today is to really analyze how RIL works, dissect its, let's say, tricky second element, this idea of exclusive control, and specifically examine how courts manage that element when, just like in the scenario you laid out, control is consecutive, not singular. We'll use the landmark case Collins v. Superior Air Ground Ambulance Service, Inc.
Okay, let's unpack RAL first then, this line,
Yeah.
right? The thing speaks for itself. So what is the fundamental statement of this doctrine, and what's its vital policy purpose in negligence law?
Well, the doctrine, and you see this in Illinois cases like Metz and Gatlin, basically states that the accident itself, the injury, provides reasonable circumstantial evidence of negligence if two key elements are met.
Okay, two elements.
And its policy purpose, it's really about ensuring justice. It allows plaintiffs to prove negligence even when the direct evidence is primarily, maybe even solely, within the knowledge and control of the defendant, especially when the plaintiff is, helpless or incapacitated.
And what are those two foundational elements, the ones that turn a circumstantial injury into what you called prima facie proof of negligence?
Okay, first, the occurrence, the event, is one that ordinarily does not happen in the absence of negligence. Think, things don't just go wrong like this without someone messing up.
Makes sense. And second,
The injury was caused by an agency or instrumentality within the defendant's exclusive control.
wait, let's pause on that second one. Exclusive control. That sounds very specific. If RIL really requires a single identifiable thing controlled by a single defendant, like a exploding soda bottle in a factory worker's hands, something clear-cut, how can a doctrine based on exclusive control possibly apply when the plaintiff was passed between two different parties, one after the other? That seems like the core paradox here.
And that paradox is precisely why the courts had to adapt, why they developed the exception we see in our sources today. To really understand how it works in practice, we absolutely have to look at the facts of the Collins case.
All right, then. Let's analyze Collins v. Superior Air Ground Ambulance Service, Inc. Tell us the story, but focus specifically. What are the legally dispositive facts that really set up this legal quandary?
Okay. The plaintiff was Laura Collins. She was 83 years old, bedridden, diabetic, and importantly, unable to speak due to a prior stroke. So completely dependent on her caregivers.
Vulnerable.
Very. She was transported by Superior Ambulance to Alden Rehabilitation on June 7, 1999. She stayed under Alden's care for several days, and then Superior Ambulance brought her back home on June 12th.
Okay, so two distinct periods of care.
Exactly. And crucially, upon returning home, her daughter immediately noticed she was in pain and dehydrated. A subsequent medical exam revealed a severe injury, a fractured right distal tibia and fibula, a broken leg.
Wow. And the lawsuit.
The lawsuit named both Superior Ambulance and Alden Rehabilitation, alleging the injury occurred while Laura Collins was under their joint and/or consecutive control. They didn't know which one, so they sued both.
That daughter's discovery right upon return seems critical. So given those facts, what was the core legal issue on appeal? What question did the court have to answer?
The precise issue was this. Is a complaint factual sufficient under the doctrine of res ipsa loquitur when you have multiple named defendants who didn't jointly control the situation at the same time, but instead had consecutive control over the injured party, and that injured party was helpless?
Okay. What rule of law did the court apply to tackle that? And did they need to tweak the standard rule? Please state the full black-letter rule and break down its testable elements for us.
Sure. The court applied the standard two-element RIL test, drawing heavily from the Gatlin case precedent. The black-letter rule requires the plaintiff to prove, element 1, an occurrence that ordinarily does not happen in the absence of negligence.
Right. It speaks for itself part.
Exactly. And element 2, that the injury was caused by an instrumentality within the defendant's exclusive control. Now, the legal heavy lifting here involved interpreting that second element, exclusive control, liberally enough to cover the situation of consecutive custody.
That second element, exclusive control, really is the whole ballgame here, isn't it?
Hmm.
How did the court handle that difficulty? Let's start the court's elemental analysis. Walk us through it step by step. How did the court apply the first element, the negligence inference? Was it obvious this wouldn't happen without negligence?
Well, the court didn't just assume. It relied on specific evidence presented with the complaint. There was a supplemental physician's report.
Ah, expert opinion.
Yes, and that report explicitly stated that the fracture and the dehydration would not have occurred in the absence of negligence. The injury itself, a broken leg, severe dehydration, happening while under professional care, was seen as medically certain evidence of some kind of failure. So that was enough to satisfy the first element, at least for the pleading stage.
That makes sense. A broken leg under medical supervision. Yeah, that certainly seems to speak for itself. Now let's get to the heart of it. How did the court apply the crucial second element, exclusive control, given that Collins was passed between Superior and Alden?
Okay, so Superior Ambulance argued, quite logically from their perspective, that RIL shouldn't apply to them because Collins was only in their specific control for a few hours during the transports.
They tried to isolate their period of control.
Right. But the court rejected that narrow view. It relied heavily on the precedent from Gatlin. The court reasoned that Mrs. Collins was effectively in the exclusive control of the named group, that is, Superior and/or Alden, from the moment she left her home until she returned injured. The key was that the plaintiff had named all the parties who had sequential control and management over her during the relevant window.
Ah, so by naming both potential tortfeasors.
Exactly. By naming both, the element was sufficiently pleaded to raise the inference of negligence against the group collectively. The burden then shifts.
So naming everyone involved in the sequence covers the control requirement against the group.
Okay.
And after analyzing both elements that way, what was the court's final conclusion in Collins?
The trial court had initially dismissed the case. The appellate court reversed that dismissal. It concluded that where you have, in this case, just two defendants who had consecutive control over the plaintiff, and either one could plausibly have caused the injuries, and both are named in the lawsuit, then the complaint is sufficient to raise the inference of negligence under RIL. The case could proceed.
To really nail down this idea of collective or consecutive control, we probably need to look at the precedent that Collins relied on so heavily. Gatlin v. Reuter. What were the legally dispositive facts in that case?
Right. Gatlin is key. It involved an infant, a baby, who sustained some pretty serious injuries, scratches, a bruise, and critically a skull fracture, which tragically led to cerebral palsy.
Oh, terrible.
Yes. And the key factual ambiguity was the timing of the injury. It could have happened either during the actual delivery process, which was handled by the obstetrician, Dr. Reuter.
Okay, possibility one.
Or possibility two, it could have happened immediately afterward while the newborn was admitted to the nursery at Riverside Medical Center. So the parents sued both the doctor and the hospital.
That presents an almost identical control problem, just different actors. The doctor, then the hospital staff. So what was the core legal issue that the Supreme Court reviewed in Gatlin?
The issue was whether the plaintiff had presented enough evidence to even raise a genuine issue of fact about whether Dr. Reuter specifically had control over whatever caused the injuries, even though the hospital staff, the second defendant, was also involved sequentially right around the time the injury likely occurred.
Okay. What rule of law did the Gatlin court apply? And did it give any specific instructions about this exclusive control element when you have multiple defendants like this?
It applied the standard two-element RIL rule, just like in Collins. But the specific instruction, which is really vital here, was that the plaintiff did not need to prove it was more probable that Dr. Reuter caused the injury versus the hospital.
Ah, they didn't have to pinpoint at that stage?
No. They only needed to present sufficient evidence to raise a genuine issue of fact as to whether one of the two named defendants had control during the relevant time frame, just enough to suggest it could have been either one.
Okay, let's walk through the elements again for this precedent case. The elemental analysis in Gatlin. How did the court handle the first element, the negligence inference? Was a skull fracture during birth obviously negligence?
Yes, that one was pretty straightforward. The court found that an infant sustaining a skull fracture leading to cerebral palsy, either during delivery or immediately after in the nursery, is clearly an event that would not ordinarily occur without negligence. It's just not a normal outcome of childbirth or newborn care. So element 1 was easily satisfied.
Understood. Now, how did the court specifically analyze the crucial second element, control, regarding the two entities, Dr. Reuter and the hospital? How did they handle the other situation?
Well, since the evidence indicated the injury occurred while the baby was either being delivered by Dr. Reuter or being cared for immediately after by the hospital personnel.
The two consecutive phases.
Right. The court found there was enough circumstantial evidence suggesting the injury happened at the hands of either Dr. Reuter or the Riverside staff, because the plaintiff showed the injury happened during the period when these two named defendants had custody, sequentially.
The court said that was enough.
Yes, the court was satisfied that this met the control requirement against the group, allowing the inference of negligence to stand against both, pending further evidence.
And so, what was the final conclusion in Gatlin?
The Supreme Court reversed the lower court's summary judgment that had favored Dr. Reuter. It essentially established the binding principle: RIL can apply to multiple defendants who successively, or even jointly, had control over the patient during the period when the injury likely occurred, provided, and this is key, all the potential parties responsible are named in the suit.
That sequential application really ties back neatly to the underlying policy. The Collins court specifically mentioned Laura Collins was like the plaintiff in another case, Kolakowski, which itself cited the really famous landmark case, Ybarra v. Spangard. It said she lacked the knowledge, control, and ability to identify the injuring instrumentality. So can you explain that foundational policy basis? Why does the law bend the exclusive control rule when multiple defendants have this kind of consecutive control over someone helpless?
This is fundamentally about the law protecting those who literally cannot protect or speak for themselves. The Ybarra case, which involved an unconscious patient injured during surgery, explained the rationale perfectly. It said basically, when a patient submits to the care and custody of multiple doctors and nurses, is rendered unconscious, or, like Mrs. Collins, is incapacitated and unable to communicate, and then comes out with an injury.
They have no way to know what happened.
Exactly. The facts are exclusively within the defendant's collective knowledge. So the law effectively shifts the burden of initial explanation onto that group of custodians. It forces them to come forward and explain what happened, rather than letting them hide behind the patient's inability to point fingers.
So it doesn't really matter if the victim is unconscious on an operating table, or conscious but, say, paralyzed and unable to speak like Mrs. Collins.
Yeah.
Legally, the effect is the same. They are helpless witnesses to their own injury.
Precisely.
And the court essentially forces Superior and Alvin, in this case, to be the ones to explain the broken leg.
That's the core idea. The critical legal conclusion is that RIL's exclusive control element can be satisfied simply by pleading that the injury occurred while the victim was in the consecutive control and management of all the named defendants who could possibly have caused the harm.
Okay, this has been a really thorough deep dive into applying RIL, especially in these tricky multi-defendant consecutive control scenarios. For the listener, maybe someone facing a complex negligence question, perhaps on an exam or in practice, what's the step-by-step diagnostic checklist for using RIL, making sure to incorporate this rule for consecutive control?
Absolutely. We can synthesize these rules into a practical, actionable framework for analysis. Think of it like a checklist. First step, ask, is direct evidence lacking? Remember, RIL is a tool of necessity. If the plaintiff actually knows precisely who caused the harm, who dropped the patient, who left the instrument inside, then RIL probably isn't needed.
Right, use direct proof if you have it.
Second, state the RIL rule clearly. Always identify the two core elements. 1, the negligence inference, and 2, the control element.
Get the basics down.
Third, test element 1, negligence inference. Ask yourself, would this specific injury, like the broken leg in Collins or the skull fracture in Gatlin, ordinarily occur without someone being negligent? Use common sense, maybe medical knowledge, or, as in Collins, expert testimony, if available, to establish this baseline probability.
Okay.
Fourth, and this is the crucial one we focus on today, test element 2, control. Ask, did a single defendant have sole exclusive control over whatever caused the injury? If yes, then RIL applies in the classic sense. Pretty straightforward.
Easy case.
But if multiple defendants are involved, like Alden and Superior, then ask, were all the potential tortfeasors, everyone who had custody of the victim during the potential injury window, even if their control was consecutive one after the other, were they all named in the complaint?
Got to name everyone who could have done it.
Yes. And then consider the victim's state. If the victim was helpless, unconscious, unable to communicate, like Mrs. Collins or the patient in Ybarra, then the control requirement is generally met against the group, precisely because the law shifts that burden of initial explanation onto those named custodians.
The helplessness triggers the burden shift for control.
Correct. And finally, step 5, conclusion. If you find that both elements are met based on your analysis, then the facts provide prima facie evidence of negligence. This allows the case to survive dismissal and proceed, essentially forcing the defendants to come forward and explain their conduct to avoid liability.
That structured diagnostic approach really makes navigating the whole multi-defendant RIL puzzle seem much less daunting. It's quite fascinating how the law sort of bends the definition of exclusive control to make sure a helpless victim still has a path to potential justice.
It really is. And what's particularly fascinating, I think, is how the application of RIL in these cases shifts the dynamic. It requires the defendants not just to deny fault, wasn't me, but to actively offer an explanation. The doctrine compels the custodians, the ones with the knowledge, to open the books, essentially, and reveal the facts. And that's the ultimate goal when the victims simply cannot testify about what happened to them.
So thinking about that burden shift, what does this all mean for you, the listener? If RIL successfully placed that burden of initial explanation on both Superior and Alden in the Collins case, what specific kind of evidence, going beyond just saying, we didn't do it, do you think those defendants would have realistically needed to produce to successfully rebut the inference of negligence? Would Alden need detailed nursing notes, incident reports showing no falls? Would Superior need transport logs, maybe testimony from the EMTs about the patient's condition before and after transport? Something to mull over as you explore the next layer of tort defenses.